Hi everyone, my name is Lyllian Corbin, and today I will be talking to you about a solitary bivoltine sweat bee, Lasioglossum Dialictus ellisiae, from an Ancestrally Eusocial subgenus, and I am a master's student in my second year at Brock University, and I work in Dr. Richard's lab. Sweat bees are well known for their social diversity, and today I'm focusing on the subgenus Lasioglossum Dialictus. So the phylogeny I'm showing here was published by Gibbs in 2012, and I included the social behaviors that are confirmed in the literature so far. So the squares represent the behaviors, the red squares being eusocial species that have queen and worker generations in the same nest, queens being the primary egg layers and workers being the primary foragers. The green squares represent social parasites, so they invade the nests of social species. And the blue squares represent solitary species, so the females nest alone, and the gray squares are unknown. And I also have the voltinism of the species on here as well, which is the number of broods that are produced in a single breeding season. So the dark circles represent bivoltine species that produce 2 broods, and the white circles represent univoltine species that produce 1 brood, and then the gray circles are unknown. So the ancestor of Dialictus is believed to be eusocial, and we see here that some species have maintained eusociality while others have reverted to solitary behavior. And some solitary species like L. up here have maintained bivoltinism, which is linked to eusociality. But the big point is that the behaviors of many of these species are unknown, so there's currently a demand in the literature for more data, which will help us interpret the evolutionary transitions that occur in this group. So one example is Lasioglossum ellisiae, which is suspected to be eusocial, and we can infer that from their relationship to L. parvum, but there's no data in the literature describing their behavior. And we've collected a lot of ellisiae bees in the Niagara region as part of a long-term pan-trapping study. So our main objective was to investigate their social behavior by inferring their voltinism and sociality from our collections. And then we compared the data with L. laevissimum, which is a Dialictus species that was confirmed as eusocial from local nest observations. And that was published by Awde and Richards in 2018. So this species served as a baseline for our inferences. So we inferred their flight phenology from our pan-trap data collections to infer their voltinism. And pan-traps are these bright colored plastic bowls that you see in the top left corner here, which are useful for collecting foraging bees. And the assumption is that the number of bees we collect each week is proportional to the number of bees flying. So we wanted to know how many peaks in females there were. And if we notice that there was 1 peak, then the species is univoltine. So that peak represents overwintered foundresses that are foraging for their first and only brood. And generally, univoltine species are solitary, or univoltine sweat bee species are solitary. If there were 2 peaks in abundance, then it meant that the species is bivoltine. So the first peak represents spring foundresses foraging for brood 1, and the second peak represents summer females foraging for brood 2. And bivoltine species can be either solitary or eusocial. So we analyzed pan-trap data across multiple sites and years, and to account for a sampling effort, we used the average number of bees collected per week to infer the flight phenologies. And these are the flight phenologies for L. laevissimum on the top and L. ellisiae on the bottom. So on the x-axis, we have week number, week 0 representing the start of the breeding season in April, and week 25 representing the end of the breeding season in October. And on the y-axis, we have the average number of bees collected per week, and the dotted line is a Loess smoother that we added to identify peaks in female abundance. So in both species, there are 2 distinct peaks in female abundance, and I've pointed at them with black arrows on the screen there. So there's a spring peak, which are the green bars, and a summer peak, which are the dark yellow, slightly orange bars. And the presence of males in blue indicates the timing of brood emergence. So in L. laevissimum, locally, we know that no males are produced in the first brood. So the males appearing on week 19 here indicate the timing that brood 2 is emerging. And for L. ellisiae, males initially appeared on week 11, which would indicate that brood 1 is emerging around that time, and then they appear later on week 23, which indicates that brood 2 is emerging. So laevissimum and ellisiae exhibit bivoltine phenologies, and from nest observations, we know that laevissimum is bivoltine, so our pan-trap data agrees with the nest data. So to distinguish between solitary bivoltinism and eusociality, we compared body size and ovarian development in the females. And in a solitary bivoltine species, we expect there will be no difference in size or ovarian development. But in a eusocial bivoltine species, we expect that most summer females will represent workers, which are typically small and non-reproductive. So there should be differences in size and ovarian development. So to compare body size, we measured head width as the widest distance across the head, including the compound eyes here, which I've illustrated with that drawing. And the middle drawing just shows how we measured head width under a dissecting microscope using an ocular micrometer. And these box plots show the comparisons between groups. So on the x-axis, we have the spring and summer female groups with their sample sizes, and on the y-axis, we have head width in millimeters. And so in ellisiae, we did not find a significant difference in head width, which was likely due to the small sample size for spring females. But based on the data, we know that queens are significantly larger than workers. And in ellisiae, the spring females had significantly larger head widths than summer females. So to compare ovarian development, we rehydrated the specimens in distilled water for 24 hours and scored oocyte size relative to a fully developed oocyte, and then summed those scores together for the total ovarian development score of each female. So the picture on the bottom left just shows an example of looking at the ovaries in a petri dish, and the drawings show the different levels of development for the oocytes. So then undeveloped oocytes indicate no ovarian development, and those females are non-reproductive. Then the developing oocytes range from 1/4 to 3/4 developed, and then a fully developed oocyte. And so a female with at least 1/3 or fully developed oocyte is considered highly reproductive. So now showing ovarian development on the y-axis. In ellisiae, we found that spring females had significantly greater ovarian development than summer females, and that agreed with nest data. And for ellisiae, there was no significant difference between groups. And we also examined mandibular and wing wear, which indicates the amount of work performed by each female. So as a female performs more nest maintenance and foraging tasks, they accumulate more wear. And unworn mandibles are very pointed, and they become more rounded over time to the point where they're completely blunt on the ends or completely worn. And unworn wings have these smooth defined edges, and as they become more worn, they accumulate more tears. So we examined wear and ovarian development together for a better picture of the life history strategy of the summer females. So in solitary species, the summer females forage and lay eggs, so we expect them to be worn and highly reproductive. And in eusocial species, most of the summer females forage and do not lay eggs, so we expect them to be worn and non-reproductive. So looking at the proportions of females that were collected by week that were worn and either highly reproductive or non-reproductive, and I hope you appreciate my Halloween colors. On the x-axis, we have the week number, and on the y-axis, we have the number of females from our dissection data. Ellisiae, most of the summer females were worn and non-reproductive, which are the black bars. So clearly they were working, but they still had undeveloped oocytes. That's the eusocial life history strategy. And in ellisiae, most of the summer females were worn and highly reproductive, which are the orange bars. So they were working and possessed at least 1/3 fully developed ovary, or oocyte, sorry. And they exhibit a solitary life history strategy. So to quickly recall our predictions, for a solitary bivoltine species, we expected no difference in size or ovarian development. And for a eusocial bivoltine species, we expected that spring females would be larger than summer females, and they would also have higher ovarian development. And we found that in ellisiae, the spring females were larger than the summer females, but there was no difference in ovarian development, and most summer females were worn and highly reproductive. So ellisiae is likely solitary bivoltine. And for ellisiae, based on the nest data, spring females were larger than summer females, and based on our collection data, spring females had higher ovarian development than the summer females, which agreed with the nest data. And most of the summer females were worn and non-reproductive. So this followed our predictions for a eusocial species. So to quickly revisit the phylogeny that I showed earlier, I included inferences on evolutionary transitions that could be occurring in this group. And this diagram here shows the proposed transitions from the earliest ancestral behavior to the descendant behavior, which is eusociality. And so ellisiae is one of 3 species that are outlined on the phylogeny there that illustrate a reversal from eusociality to solitary bivoltinism. However, they still exhibit a size difference. And an interesting comparison is that my lab mate Alex investigated the social behavior of Lasioglossum zonulum for his master's, which he's finishing this year. And they are from an ancestrally solitary subgenus. And from specimens in our collections, he found that they are solitary Bivoltine and do not exhibit a size difference. So the fact that ellisiae is solitary but retaining that size difference could represent an intermediate state, somewhere in between here, where they haven't fully reverted to being solitary. And from studies on L. which exhibits the same traits, this difference could indicate the establishment of eusocial behavior. So it could mean that maybe ellisiae is actually on its way to becoming eusocial. But unfortunately, I think that's all the time that I have for now. So I will thank you all for listening, and a big thanks to everyone that I've listed here for their help: Miriam Richards, David Awde, and Alex Prue. And I also want to give a big thanks to my present and past teammates at our lab, because they've all helped me on my journey, and I am willing to take your questions.
That's great. Thanks, Lyllian. Yeah, so we have a question from Jester Crook. Do you expect the size difference between spring and summer females is an ancestral trait?
So the size difference, so we believe it's a eusocial strategy. So it could be an if we're talking about Dialictus itself, it could be them retaining that ancestral trait of the ancestor of Dialictus. But usually in a solitary species, there's no size difference, and we think of solitary behavior as the ancestral behavior. So I hope that answers your question.
So I think we have time for one more question. Could you explain some of your results as evidence for mixed strategies, social polymorphism?
Oh, that's a great question. Sorry, I'm just thinking in my head. So it could be that if foundresses are provisioning again or foraging again in the summertime, they could be exhibiting what we call partial bivoltinism, where both the foundresses and the summer females are contributing to the second brood. So that could be one case. And if the summer females, some could be staying in the nest to help their mothers provision another brood. So we did find some non-reproductive females in that group. So they could be staying behind and exhibiting a eusocial strategy, and while other females are leaving the nest and provisioning their own brood. So if there is that mix of social and solitary strategies, then yes, that could exhibit social polymorphism.
Great.